wouldn't make it if I didn't have a sip of water, so I wasn't abandoning you. I didn't know how many we would have tonight because of the wind and the rain. I got a call from Keith earlier, and he said that they were not going to come over because of the possibility of some really bad weather over in the Osage area. So I was mobbed coming in a while ago as the kids were being dismissed. I started to count them after 13. I had my feet stepped on and I quit counting. But it's really good to see all the kids come in on a cold and wet day. It worked. We have this little thing going with the machine back there. Will the first slide come up? So it does. Well, we are close to finishing our discussion on the book of Nehemiah, and we are going to get a little bit closer to that conclusion tonight with looking at 11 and 12. A couple of things I wanted to look at very quickly. You know, in the previous chapters, particularly chapter 9, which we just read in its totality, talks a lot about the history of the Jewish people, the Israelites really, and the Jewish people in particular. Remember, the Jews were really the tribe of Judah. When you say the word Jew, you may be attempting to say all of the Israelites, but in reality, you're referring to those that recycled into Judah following the decree of Cyrus' return. So the Jews were really those that repopulated the small area of Judah. And but it's interesting here, starting in chapter 9, this very long rendering of their history. And I put it to you for a little discussion. Why do you think that Ezra, along with Nehemiah, took the time to write in detail this chapter 9, and we read it, to relate the history of the Jews to them? Why do you think that they did that? Any idea? Yeah, and they probably needed to revisit it. Remember, they don't have copies of the Bible. They don't have copies of anything. The priests and the Levites were the ones that had copies, and then they were probably very rare. And so the only thing the people really had was a remembrance of what a priest or somebody told them, a Levite teacher would have taught them. So this was just as much for them to be recalling their history as anything. What happens when you leave things to oral memory? What happens? It changes, it gets kind of sloppy. And so this was an attempt by Ezra and Nehemiah to recall the accuracy of the history. And if you ever want just a really quick thumbnail sketch of the Old Testament history of the Jews and the whole nation of Israel, read chapter 9. It's a summary for you. And it's interesting there at the end of chapter 9, he says, because we have make a firm covenant in writing on the sealed document and the names of those of our princes and Levites and priests. So they actually took the time to write this, to read it, and then have all of the leaders sign this thing as an attempt to try to seal once again their understanding of what God wanted. It didn't take a generation of people to drift away. And when you continue to read, as we will later in the last chapter, what happens when the people stayed away from doing what they should have done? Nehemiah isn't finished. Chapter 12 is kind of an interesting chapter we'll review at the end, probably the last Wednesday night of the month. Next week it's going to be a devotional because we generally don't have too many people here on that Wednesday night. But we bring ourselves to chapter 11, and we're going to be looking at 11 and 12. And there's just a lot of names here. And since our nameologist, Stacy, isn't here to read all of these names with great accuracy, we're not going to read them. But we are going to read certain portions of this and bring about some discussion. I think that's big enough. Yeah, you can see that. I never know because I see back here small characters, so hopefully you can read them up there. So starting in chapter 11 and verse 1, Nehemiah. Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 and 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 of the 10 remained in their towns. And the people blessed all of the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is essentially an unpopulated town. They've rebuilt this wall, and we'll read more about that at the end of our study tonight. They've rebuilt this wall. They have placed the gates in their place, but there's hardly anybody living there because all of the workers, remember, were coming in from so it got to the point where Nehemiah, when they finally got the gates halfway, the walls halfway up, and some of the gates in place, what did Nehemiah do to keep the people there? He locked the doors. He shut the gates. Said, you come in here and work, and oh, by the way, you have to stay in here for a while. And because they needed to get the job done, and people were coming and going, and the work wasn't making tremendous progress, so he came up with a way to keep them there. And so the point is that Jerusalem was an unpopulated town. It was a home of ruins. When the Jews lost that property, when Nebuchadnezzar came in, and you'll remember about 606, just going back in history, Nebuchadnezzar he didn't lay siege. He said, you follow me or else. And the king said, okay, we'll follow you. And Nebuchadnezzar set up the puppet kings, and that was in 606. But about 10 or 15 years later, they said, we're kind of tired of paying all this heavy taxes over to Nebuchadnezzar. And so they tried to establish an alliance with whom? You remember? With Egypt. Well, remember, God has a plan, and God is ultimately going to take these people off into captivity. And he used Nebuchadnezzar to make this happen. So in about 586, when they stop paying their taxes and rebel, Nebuchadnezzar sends over the army again, and what do they do to the city? They wipe it out to the point that they knock down these huge walls. How much effort would it take to knock down the walls of this city? Tremendous effort. Now, this is going to happen again in 70. It's not going to be as much of a fortress then. When the Romans came in under Titus, their job there was to knock down the temple and get rid of the Jews' point of religion. But it took a lot of effort to put these huge holes and knock down these walls. And what was Nebuchadnezzar's purpose in knocking down the walls? They wouldn't have a fortress. And we know that through the early portions of the chapter, there are those that don't want this to be a fortress. Sanballat and Tobiah and the guys that they don't want. Tobiah is going to play an interesting role yet at the end of this book. But now the walls are up and the gates are in place. And Nehemiah and Ezra are making the people now that the house of God, the temple is there, the walls are up. Now what's the next thing that has to happen? They have to understand the law. Because if you don't understand the law of God, you're going to fail again, and you're going to be back into the same boat. So now we need people to come and live in this ghost town. The walls are up, the temple is there, but nobody is living there. Why do you think nobody wants to live in Jerusalem? Got 2 or 3 reasons?
All the infrastructure is.
Yeah. How many people are planning to move to Mayfield, Kentucky today? And I use that very seriously because it is laid waste, sorrowfully, in all of the towns in that general area. There's nothing there to live in. They have to rebuild a home. They have to go about building the infrastructure. What's another reason they don't want to live there?
Too many animals.
Chase out all the animals and that kind of thing. It's kind of a zoo.
Well, too many enemies.
And enemies, yes. There's a lot of challenge there, political and religious enemies. Where? They what? Yeah, they've got to have a home, and so that takes work. They've got to take all these rocks and rebuild the houses. So it really is laid waste. Plus, what do you have to have when you have a large number of people? You have to have an economic structure.
Some way to make money.
Yeah, and what is the only thing they have? Is agriculture, right? So they're out living in all of these cities, and I've got a map here somewhere. It's in the pile coming up. It shows you here's Jerusalem, and here are all of these little almost city-states where you've got a little city and then a bunch of little villages around it that support that little city. So they have these micro-economic centers, And what Nehemiah is trying to do is get you to come back and build Jerusalem into the main central place. And so he has this idea, we're going to have 1 in 10 come. And how do you get to be one of the 10?
Drew a card.
It says here that they cast lots. I remember back in the Vietnam War when I had a draft card and a number, and you hope that your number didn't come up. Well, in a similar way, these people had a number of some kind, and certain ones got selected. Now, there were those, it says here, who willingly went into the city, and they were blessed. Hey, do we have any volunteers before we pick the first one? And Joe says, I'll move. So he takes, so they're blessing these people because there's nothing in Jerusalem to do except work and build up the town. So they go through this process, and they finally have a number of people there. And if you read through the rest of chapter 11, you see some interesting numbers. You see various ones of the priests, various ones of the tribe of Benjamin, various ones of the singers, and various numbers there. And you end up with the number there, it's 3,044. Now that's men. So if you have, a large number of those men that have wives and some children, you may easily have 6,000 or 7,000 people. But in a town the size of Jerusalem with all these walls, that's still not very many people. And they still don't have an economy. So they've got to go through a process of making Jerusalem function and work again. And so that's what chapter 11 is really all about, making the system work. So some were willing to move into town, so to speak. Others were chosen by lot to go into the city. And we asked the question, why do you think there wasn't a mad rush to move into town? And we kind of talked about that. There wasn't a lot going on. Unless you were one of the priests or Levites or somebody like that, you didn't have a real reason to be there. So Nehemiah is living there, and he says, we've got to get things rolling again. So what if we were to the town of Ponca City went through a major disaster and it's really laid waste. And our city government said, we've got to get this rolling again. You've got to get that infrastructure going. You got to have some money flowing. So this was really a major economic challenge as well as a community challenge.
Because John, you have to have, if you think about it, you have to have things like, how do we get food? How do we get water? Where do we lose the latrine?
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of things that have to
Yeah.
happen. I know having lived through several hurricanes down the Gulf Coast of Mississippi,
Yeah.
that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
I remember driving to Biloxi to get water, ice, just basics.
Yeah. So when you were one that said, I'll go, you were also saying, I'm taking my pair of gloves because I know I'm going to be moving a lot of rocks around. So they had this infrastructure to build up. And so the idea here is that they became organized. How do you do things without being organized? You can't just have 700 people move into town and start doing whatever they want. They have to have some organization to them. And so we are not told all of the detail, but we are told that there was this need for the leaders in Jerusalem to bring in people to live there. You've got to have schools, you've got to have places to live, you've got to have firewood, you've got to have all of these things happening. So they're rebuilding this infrastructure, and that's what most of chapter 11 is really all about there. And then as we get into the last portion of this section here, it says, as for the villages with their fields, some of the people of Judah lived in, and there are a number of different cities named here that I'm not going to try to express here, but they were trying to get the economy going in the little towns as well. The people of Benjamin lived from Geba onward, and there's some other mention of these other places. Just a lot of information is provided about where people were living. Now, the question I have for you is, if the Old Testament is given to us not to follow as a law, but as an example, what are some of the examples? What are some of the concepts of life and living, Christian living, do you think we get out of this chapter? That's just a long list of names. Well, the first one I come up with is the organization. If you're going to have a culture, let's call a congregation a culture, a microculture, you've got to have organization within that, right? You've got to have plans, you've got to have leadership, you've got to have things that will work. Even though you've got these little centralized villages around, you still have to have some local organization. But there's also a lot of names given here. And why were names so important to the Jews? So-and-so was the son of so-and-so, was the son of so-and-so, et cetera, et cetera.
Because somewhere in there is the coming Messiah.
Yeah. What were the Jews very proud of? Their lineage. Also, you know, we go back and we read it in the book of Malachi, where there were certain ones that were trying to be registered as priests, but they could not prove their lineage. They say, well, I'm of the tribe of Levi. Well, prove it. What other source did they have than lists like this? And so if you go back in here, you see several places in Ezra and Nehemiah as well, where it says the list of those before the exile, that list, the genealogies were brought out. And so all of these names help to establish a person's lineage. And if you wanted to be considered one of the priests, if you want to be considered a Levite, you had to be able to prove it. And so that's one of the reasons why we have so many names listed here. This provides for us proof of the organization and gives us a tool to go back to prove, as Denny said, the lineage of Jesus. Have you ever seen one of these charts that has, here's Jesus down at the bottom, and it starts with Adam? Where do you think they get all these names that come down to prove that Jesus is a descendant of David, the descendant of Abraham, the descendant of God? Where do they get all of this? These lists. So while we might get a little bit bored and try to read, Bani, the son of Hashbah, the son of Metha, these kinds of things, they really do provide for us an important tool. So that's really the essence of chapter 11. Gives us a listing. It shows us that people are going to be living in the villages around Jerusalem, but they're not in Jerusalem. One of the cities that's listed is Ziklag. And I was reading this afternoon about the importance of Ziklag. It is a archaeological, what am I trying to say? It's a treasure trove of information to prove many of the things that the Bible says. They find in the libraries and in the tell at Ziklag, and it's listed right here. One of the cities that are listed. The list shows that there were several important towns around the city of Jerusalem that people came from and worked from. The small settlements of Benjamin were assigned Levites, is one of the interesting things here. Benjamin was a very small tribe. When we think of Israel to the north and Judah to the south was really a combination of Benjamin and Judah. But Benjamin was so small, it just kind of gets melted into that. But when they went back and lived in their territorial cities, it was so small that there were no Levites. And so they actually went through a process of assigning Levites to the towns of Benjamin. So what would they have? They would have somebody to teach them. So even that little detail is pointed out in chapter 11 there. So we worked through 11 just to say that this list is more than just a passing list. There's lots of little tidbits here. For example, when we get to verse 23, so there was a command of the king concerning them, and they fixed a provision for the singers and for their everyday requirement. Even those, if you'll recall, under David and Solomon that were assigned to be singers in the temple, were set aside, were set apart, and they were to have an allotment. And we see even the king over in Nineveh is saying, you got to provide for them as well. That's how detailed things were. So God, through all of this, is providing for all of the mechanisms for Judah to come back to life. Even though they were, as they say, we're captives and we're slaves in our own town, our own city, our own country, there's still organization being provided. So then we move into chapter 12, and that's where I want to spend most of our time tonight. Starting with chapter 12, verse 1, these are the priests and the Levites who were called, who came up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, et cetera, et cetera. Remember, time-wise, it's been many years since Zerubbabel came the first exodus from Nineveh back to Jerusalem. Remember, Zerubbabel took about 45,000 people with him. Now we're in Nehemiah. Zerubbabel's job was to come and rebuild the temple, which took a long time to do. And finally now we're working about 70 years later at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So he's even going back to the list of people that came back from Zerubbabel, which tells me they kept detailed notes. If you know anybody that does genealogical work, and don't get Lena started. She loves genealogy. You know that every little aspect of somebody's life is important. And, when they were born, when they died, the 17 cousins on the mother's side, and the half-brother here and whatever. That's what this list does. It provides additional information so they could prove the lineage of people. There's a guy named here 2 or 3 places in verses 7 and 8 and 10, Jeshua, who apparently was a priest or a high priest. And he's apparently a person of note because he's listed so many times. But when you start looking at who could be a priest, why was it important? What did it matter that Jimmy John over here could be a priest? Would it have pleased God if somebody who was not a direct descendant of Aaron be the high priest? I don't think it would. Matter of fact, we know it wouldn't. And so you had to prove. Now, God was very detailed in giving us this information. And again, I ask the question, what value is there in us reading all of this detail? How does that help us?
It proves that it's that God may have, that God was the one who planned all this and did it.
God is the one that organized their departure. They were gone for 70 years. Now they've come back. God is still involved in their lives. What else does that tell us? What else do we learn from all of the detail that's given to us? Why did Nehemiah go to all the trouble to write this down?
So they would know.
So the people would know. So we've got now about 450, 500 years for about 450 years before the time of Christ. People didn't quite understand the coming Messiah, but when he did come, we've got some records. We can prove some things. So there's just a treasure trove here if you just let it speak to you, especially if you're doing some detailed research. Remember in school you were writing a paper on something that was absolutely boring to you? Then once in a while you'd find that nugget in your research that bling, the light comes on and it's all valuable. Well, that's what this book would provide. Do what?
If you look at Matthew 1, verse 12, the
Yep.
genealogy.
Yep. And where does some of that genealogy in Matthew 12,
From the
Matthew chapter 1, come from? It comes from this kind of source. And again, it just helps us prove and understand that Jesus is indeed who he said that he was. Now, the first, 12, 15 verses here help the priests mostly prove their lineage. If you claim to be a priest, if you claim to be of the tribe of Levi, here is a tool that you could use. And you could see, hey, here's my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and I am obviously in this lineage. So that's a lot of the value here, especially verses 8 through 11. And then we get to starting in verse 12. It starts in some interesting lineages. Remember we said Zerubbabel came back, let's say here, and Nehemiah is here. But we've got a lot of time in between the two. Well, guess what he does? He lists individuals, key individuals, and their names and lineages in that period of time. And that's what these things are, starting in verse 12. In the days of Jehoiakim, 22, in the days of Elisha. There's one other here that doesn't come to mind. But anyway, he lists people that lived in Jerusalem during this period of time. They finished the temple, and he's just showing that these people lived and they could prove their lineage through that. So we get to verse 26. It says, these were the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Jeshua, the son of Zadok, and the days of Nehemiah the governor and Ezra the priest and scribe. So he's gone from Zerubbabel and the first entering back into Judah all the way down to the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And he's doing that again to just establish the credibility of what they're doing. So that gets us to, finally, a little bit of interesting history here. we have what we call, what's called in my little title in my Bible, the dedication of the wall. And starting in verse 27 and running through verse 47, we're going to see here some really interesting things take place. In chapter 4 and verse 6, the wall has now been joined together. All of the wall has been joined together. The breaches have been closed, and has now been built to half its height. We believe its finished height was about 30 feet, 26 to 30 feet. That means that halfway up, it's about 15 to 18 feet. So that's where they were in chapter 4 and verse 6. In chapter 6 and verse 15, the wall is finished after 52 days of building. So they now take it from chapter 4 to chapter 6. It's now 26 to 30 feet tall. And that may have just been the basic superstructure. Now there's some additional work that gets done. In 7 and verse 1, Nehemiah has these huge doors, these huge gates put in place. So now we've got the tall wall, and we've got all of these gates. There are lots of gates around Jerusalem. There are 12 primary gates, and there are some other gates. So these all took lots of wood. They took lots of ironwork, and they were big enough and strong enough to keep, an army out. And so the place it's now finished. And so after chapter 7, it seems we enter into what I call a parenthetical phase. It's kind of like he takes a breath for a while and he says, these are the things that happened during this period of time. But now he's going to pick the story back up in verse 27. So the wall is finished. The gates are all in place. It's been finished now. It's wide enough to do something on. And at the dedication of the wall, starting in verse 27, in Jerusalem, they sought the Levites in all of their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgiving and with singing, with cymbals and harps and lyres. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the district surrounding Jerusalem and from all of the villages of the Nephilites, whoever they were, and also Beth Gilgal and the region of Geba and Asmath. And he's talking about where all of these singers were living. For the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem, and the priests and the Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people and the gates and the wall. Now, it doesn't tell us what they did to purify themselves. But what is the symbology to you? We're not Jews. We don't live, we have a hard time placing our minds where they lived. But to you, what does it mean to purify a people? What does it mean to purify a wall or a gate? Any ideas, any thoughts? Back in the Old Testament, when they were going to purify the people, they would take an animal sacrifice, and they would take the blood, mix it with water, take a hyssop branch, and they would sprinkle it. So that's the imagery that's in my mind. I don't know if that's exactly what they did, but somehow they went through a process to say, this is dedicated to God. We're dedicating ourselves, we're dedicating this wall, we're dedicating these gates to God. They've set aside a time to do that. And they're going to make quite a bit of noise, as we're going to see. So starting with verse 31, and I brought the leaders, this really gets interesting if you haven't read it. And I brought the leaders of Judah together upon the wall. Where are they? They're upon the wall. This thing is 30 feet up in the air and wide enough to march around on. This is a thick wall. They brought them up on the wall and appointed to them 2 great choirs to give thanks. So you've got all of these singers, and some of them are going to go that way, and some of them are going to go that way, and they're going to march around the wall, and they're going to meet where the temple is, come down into the temple courtyard. Then I brought the leaders of Judah together upon the wall and appointed 2 great choirs to give thanks. One went to the south on the wall, to the dung gate. The other, they took half the leaders of Judah. It lists those there with the priests' sons and the trumpets, and the various ones are named. And Ezra was with them in verse 36. And at the fountain gate they went up straightway before them by the stairs of the city of David, and to the ascent of the wall above the house of David, to the water gate to the east. So they're walking the southern route on this wall, and they're going to come down before the temple. 38. The other choir of those who gave thanks went to the north, and I followed them. So Ezra's with the southern group, Nehemiah's with the northern group. And they walked around on the wall to the Tower of the Ovens, to the bread wall, to the broad wall, and to the gate of Ephraim, and to the gate of Joshua, and by the fish gate, and that lists several other gates there. So the choirs of verse 40, so the choirs of those who gave thanks stood at the house of God, and I had half the officials with me, and the priests, and he lists some of those. Verse 43, and they offered great sacrifices that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. And I love this. And the women and the children also rejoiced, and the joy in Jerusalem was heard far away. I think these people were somehow happy. I love that phrase, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. They've done several things to be joyful about, but when you finish a major project, it is really exciting. We were watching on television the other night some history out of World War II, and it's especially interesting to me, but it was how they enlisted a lot of women into a very secret organization to program the world's first computer, ENIAC. And they were, of course, were held to great strictness in their contact with people and whatever. But when they finally got that thing to work, there was a great celebration that they actually got the right answer, because they had worked for weeks on this one test program, and they thought the answer was this. It was a very, very complicated mathematical process. So when they plugged it all in, the first pass didn't work, second pass didn't work. So finally, when they got and they programmed this with punch panels, when they finally got the right answer, it says there was a lot of joy. There was a lot of rejoicing. And I had heard that after I had read this again. I think, well, there was probably not a lot of loud rejoicing in the hallways of that building. But this was so loud that the people from all around heard it. They were filled with joy. So the question I have for you is there anything that should bring us this kind of joy? Is there anything that people might hear us far away? Is there anything that even relates to this or parallels this in the Christian life? And I think the answer is yes, even though we kind of struggle with seeing how it's related. But when you can get up in the morning and know that the Lord is with you, it brings great joy. When you lay down at night after having a rather challenging day and know that you've been buried with Christ, know that you are a Christian, and all of the pressures of life are really squeezing in on you, there's a point of joy, of knowing if I don't wake up tomorrow, that's okay. First of all, I don't have to worry about what's bugging me, but there's great joy. The story I like to relate about this story is a true one my mom tells. When her family lived in Wichita, in Springfield, they lived across the street from this little brick church building, brick and stone, and I've seen the building. And it was a congregation of the Church of Christ. And apparently Granddad really, really enjoyed the summer, the hot summer days, because he'd sit out on the porch, and the church building didn't have air conditioning, so they raised all the windows. And apparently the church loved to sing. And he would sit out there on the porch and listen to that singing, and it inspired him. One day, the preacher came across the street, noticed that he had somehow been interested, and began to study with him. And the long of the story, the short of the story, is that Granddad was baptized. Grandma came along and was baptized, and later my mom. But it kind of, in my mind, started because Granddad was interested in hearing the beautiful singing of people rejoicing. And it relates to this story. Even far away, you could hear the rejoicing in Jerusalem. So we end up the chapter. This is I don't know if you can see this very well, but you can see several of the little towns around Jerusalem, which is kind of in the middle. And it talks about all of these towns these are the major towns, and then there were little villages around these towns that provided the infrastructure for their economy. But the problem was there was no infrastructure in Jerusalem. So that's where the 1 and 10 came in, and I just wanted to kind of see a map. You can also see here that Judea is just a province. It's not its own kingdom, and it never will be again. It's just a kind of a province. And, we read before that they're just captives and slaves in their own country. Well, that's what God said would happen if you don't follow me. But anyway, when we get into the last part of the chapter here, in verse 44 through 47, it says, on that day were appointed over the storerooms the contributions and the first fruits and the tithes, together into them the portions required by the law for the priests and for the Levites according to the fields and the towns of Judah, and they rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. In other words, the people were even excited about the fact that there was some organization finally in place. And that was important for them. It's no longer who's in charge today and what's going on tomorrow. There was some, there's something about having some organization, somebody in charge. You may not always agree with the people who are in charge, but at least there's some organization. Verse 45, and they performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did the singers and the gatekeepers according to the command of David and Solomon. Remember, David and Solomon lived almost 400 years before. But they still have a loyalty and a dedication to what David and Solomon had set up when the temple was in its glory time, the first temple. This is the new temple. It's nowhere close to where it was when Solomon built it, but there's still respect for the organization that had been set up. Verse 46, for long ago in the days of David and Asaph, they were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and songs of thanksgiving to God. You can look through the songs that we sing. Some of them are songs of praise. We're praising God for his nature and for his gifts. There's also songs of thanksgiving. So I as a song leader, I kind of like that. They had songs of praise and songs of thanksgiving to God. And that all of Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the daily portions to the singers and the gatekeepers, and they set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron. So there's this system. The people would give, a portion of it would go here, a portion of it would go there, and ultimately everybody had their little piece of the tithe, and things were organized. So we have about 2 minutes before we want to close tonight. Some final thoughts. Tracing their lineage was important to the Jews. How is our spiritual lineage important? What do you think I mean by spiritual lineage? Who is our spiritual brother? Jesus Christ. We are brothers together in Christ. And so there's this spiritual lineage there. Is that kind of important to us? It kind of is, isn't it? And so the lesson to me is, yes, these people wanted to make sure their lineage was really intact. But we don't have to have a long list of names in our spiritual lineage. It's us and the Lord. And I think there's a valuable lesson in that we could spend a lot of time on. The wall was finished, and now it was time to populate the city. Some entered it with rejoicing. What is the parallel to us regarding heaven? Are we anxious about this? You want to stay here for all of eternity? No, there ought to be rejoicing, looking forward to that time we can be with the Lord in heaven. So as they rejoiced and as they populated Jerusalem, within us ought to be an anticipation of being with the Lord forever and populating heaven, if you get the imagery there. And finally, they dedicated the wall with joy. And it says that the Lord put in their hearts this spirit of joy. They were excited. How is this a parallel to how we rejoice in the wall that God provides for us in Christ? When I mean a wall that God provides for us in Christ, I see there the wall of protection, the wall of, you get on the other side of this wall and you're in the Lord. That's a wonderful place to be. And just as they celebrated the wall that they built with their own hands, we can celebrate the protective wall of being in Christ and the joy we have in that.
Well, they also had a goal.
Yes.
had set for themselves or was set for them. And they had accomplished that goal. And there was great rejoicing
And
in
there
the
was,
accomplishment of what they did.
Mm.
And to us, our life as Christians, we have a goal. And our goal is to go to
exactly.
heaven.
Yep, yep. There are so many really good parallels if we just let our mind work through them. So, well, I appreciate your time. We'll bring this to a close here and turn it back over to our song leader of the evening.
Five 533.
I am a sheep and the Lord is my shepherd, watching over my soul to keep guarding over me ever, watching wherever I go. And when the winds blow, He is my shelter. When I'm lost and alone, He rescues me. And when the lion comes, He is my victory, constantly watching over me. He is constantly watching over me. We are His children and He is our Father, watching over our souls. Great is His love for His sons and His daughters, watching wherever we go. And when the winds blow, He is my shelter. When I'm lost and alone, He rescues me. And when the lion comes, He is my victory, constantly watching over me. He is constantly watching over me. And when the winds blow, He is my shelter. When I'm lost and alone, He rescues me. And when the lion comes, He is my victory, constantly watching over me. He is constantly watching over me.
Just a couple of announcements before we're dismissed tonight. Welcome to all. If we have any visitors with us tonight, you're welcome to come back anytime. We rejoice that Zach means in his decision to put on Christ in baptism on Sunday, and that was an exciting day. It was also exciting that Elaine Masachi, I can't pronounce it. She came forward Sunday saying she'd like to be a member of the congregation. She's moved here from Kentucky and is part of the Jurowski family, and that's exciting to us too. So it was a great Sunday morning. Madison Lehman, who is Steve and Linda Broom's granddaughter, is in the Blackwell Hospital with a severe infection. I don't think it's COVID related, but please be praying for Madison. Craig Kellison has requested prayers as well. He'll be having surgery to remove a cancerous mass on his kidneys. And I talked to Art Kirchenbauer earlier this afternoon. He gets regular updates because of his connection to the vocational center and used to work with Mike Orr. He says Mike is off the ventilator. He is struggling with blood clots in his leg. They are concerned about a chest drainage tube that's not working well, and they're going to try to correct that tomorrow. If that all goes well, they're going to try to transfer him to a long care convalescent center in Oklahoma City this week. So continue to keep Mike Orr in your prayers as well. Any other sick that we need to be noted? Lena continues to struggle with the medications that she's taking, and hopefully that's going to end on Saturday. So she wanted to come tonight, and I told her, you don't even know what day it is. But she was really wanting to be here, but I convinced her that's not the right thing to do.
I talked to Stacy, John,
Oh, great.
and he is home and doing well. He's doing his rehab, you know.
Yeah.
He said he's in pain, but he's getting better every day.
Stacy continues to make a little improvement day by day, and he's at home, and that's the important part. You convalesce so much easier at home. So we're glad that he's home. All right, closing song.